The entire courtroom burst into quiet laughter the moment Ethan Carter picked up the pen and signed the divorce papers. Across the room, Victoria Hayes, a powerful CEO worth millions, leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had just won the final battle. To her, the man sitting alone at the defense table was nothing more than a failed husband, a struggling mechanic who spent his days repairing aircraft engines while she built a corporate empire. For months, she had told everyone the same story, that Ethan lacked ambition, lacked success, and lacked the ability to provide the future she wanted for their daughter. And judging by his worn jacket, his old pickup truck parked outside, and the silence with which he accepted every insult thrown at him, it seemed she was right. But what nobody in that courtroom knew was that Ethan Carter had spent years hiding a secret so enormous it could destroy everything Victoria believed about power, wealth, and success. He didn't argue when she demanded full control of their assets. He didn't fight when her lawyers mocked his financial records. He didn't even react when she publicly questioned whether he was capable of being a good father. Instead, he calmly signed the papers, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. That should have been the end of the story. It should have been the moment Victoria celebrated her victory. Instead, it became the beginning of her downfall. Because less than 1 hour later, standing at a private airport outside Chicago, Victoria witnessed something that made the color drain from her face. As executives, pilots, and airport staff lined the runway with visible respect, a sleek private jet worth tens of millions of dollars touched down under the afternoon sun. The aircraft carried a name painted across its side in bold silver letters, a name Victoria recognized instantly: Carter Aviation. Before she could process what she was seeing, the cabin door opened. Ethan stepped forward, the same man she had laughed at, the same man she had called a failure. And as dozens of powerful executives greeted him as their founder and chairman, Victoria realized a terrifying truth. The husband she had humiliated in court was not a poor mechanic at all. He was the hidden owner of a billion-dollar aviation empire. And by the time the full truth emerged, the life she had spent years building would never be the same again. The cold marble walls of the Cook County Courthouse seemed to magnify every whisper, every judgmental glance, and every quiet laugh that followed Ethan Carter as he walked through the crowded hallway. Dressed in a faded brown jacket and worn work boots, he looked completely out of place among the expensive suits, designer handbags, and polished smiles that filled the building that morning. People barely noticed him at first, but once they realized he was the husband of Victoria Hayes, the celebrated CEO whose face regularly appeared in business magazines, their expressions changed. Some looked surprised. Others looked amused. A few openly stared. Ethan had grown used to those looks long ago. For years, he had watched people measure his worth within seconds of meeting him. They saw his rough hands stained from years of mechanical work. They saw his modest clothes. They saw the old pickup truck he drove. Then they decided exactly who he was. None of them ever bothered to look deeper. Inside courtroom 14, Victoria sat at a long, polished table surrounded by an army of attorneys. Everything about her radiated power. Her tailored white suit probably cost more than Ethan's monthly expenses. Her diamond earrings sparkled beneath the overhead lights. Her posture was flawless, confident, victorious. She looked less like a woman ending a marriage and more like a queen preparing to claim another kingdom. Beside her sat her father, Richard Hayes, a man whose cold eyes had never once hidden his contempt for Ethan. Richard came from old money, old influence, and old arrogance. From the very beginning, he had considered Ethan an embarrassing mistake his daughter would eventually correct. Today, he believed that correction was finally happening. When Ethan entered the courtroom, Richard smirked and leaned toward Victoria. Looks like he couldn't even afford a decent suit for the occasion. Victoria followed her father's gaze. A small smile appeared on her lips. Why would he? Mechanics don't need suits. The attorneys around them chuckled quietly. Ethan heard every word. He simply took his seat without responding. That silence somehow irritated Victoria more than anger would have. She wanted him to fight. She wanted him to argue. She wanted him to show weakness. Instead, he sat calmly, his expression unreadable. Years earlier, things had been very different. There was a time when Victoria had loved Ethan more than anything. Back then, she was an ambitious young executive trying to climb the corporate ladder, while Ethan was a talented aviation engineer with dreams bigger than either of them could imagine. They had met at a charity fundraiser and spent hours talking about life ambition and family. Victoria had admired his intelligence. Ethan had admired her determination. For a while, they seemed unstoppable together. But success has a way of revealing parts of people that love often hides. As Victoria's career exploded, her priorities changed. Promotions turned into executive positions. Executive positions turned into magazine covers. Magazine covers turned into invitations to elite social circles where appearances mattered more than character. The higher she climbed, the more uncomfortable she became with Ethan's simple lifestyle. He never cared about luxury watches. He never cared about exclusive clubs. He never cared about impressing strangers. While Victoria obsessed over status, Ethan remained exactly the same man she had married. At first, she found that grounding. Later, she found it embarrassing. The turning point came at one of her company's annual galas. Surrounded by investors, celebrities, and politicians, Victoria introduced Ethan to a group of executives. "This is my husband," she said. Then, after a brief pause, she added, "He works with aircraft maintenance." Ethan noticed she deliberately avoided mentioning his engineering background. He noticed the amused smiles that followed. He noticed how quickly the conversation moved away from him. On the drive home, neither of them spoke. It was the first time he truly understood that Victoria no longer saw him as an equal. From that moment, the distance between them grew larger every year. Victoria spent more time traveling, attending conferences, closing deals, and expanding her empire. Ethan spent more time raising their daughter, Olivia. He attended school meetings. He helped with homework. He stayed awake through fevers and nightmares. While Victoria built a company, Ethan built a relationship with their child. Yet none of that mattered to the people around Victoria. In their eyes, success was measured by money and influence. Ethan had neither, or so they believed. Months before the divorce, Victoria stopped pretending altogether. She openly criticized him in front of friends. She mocked his modest lifestyle. She complained that he lacked ambition. The cruelest part was that many people believed her. After all appearances seemed to support her story. Victoria owned luxury penthouses, sports cars, and shares in a billion-dollar corporation. Ethan spent most mornings at an aircraft maintenance facility wearing coveralls. The contrast appeared obvious. What nobody knew was that Ethan never tried to defend himself because he no longer cared what strangers thought. The only opinion that mattered to him belonged to Olivia. Unfortunately, that wasn't enough to save the marriage. When Victoria filed for divorce, she approached it like a corporate acquisition. Everything had to be controlled. Everything had to be won. She hired the most aggressive legal team money could buy. She demanded primary custody. She requested extensive control over financial arrangements. She even prepared documents portraying Ethan as financially incapable of providing the lifestyle Olivia deserved. Every move was calculated. Every step was designed to ensure victory. Yet something about Ethan's reaction confused everyone involved. He didn't fight. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. Most men facing the loss of their marriage and possibly their daughter would have been devastated. Ethan simply remained calm. His attorney Daniel Brooks repeatedly asked whether he wanted to challenge certain accusations. Ethan always gave the same answer. Not yet. Au sang. The courtroom proceedings dragged on for weeks. During that time, Victoria's confidence only grew stronger. Every hearing seemed to reinforce her belief that she was right. Reporters covering the case painted her as a successful executive escaping an unhappy marriage. Social media users praised her independence. Business magazines highlighted her achievements. Meanwhile, Ethan became little more than a footnote in someone else's success story. The public never saw the late nights he spent comforting Olivia when she cried herself to sleep. They never saw the birthday parties Victoria missed because of meetings. They never saw the sacrifices he made. They only saw what Victoria allowed them to see. On the morning of the final hearing, the tension inside the courtroom was almost unbearable. Everyone sensed that the end had arrived. Victoria appeared radiant. Richard looked triumphant. Their attorneys reviewed documents with confident smiles. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly beside Daniel Brooks. The contrast between the two sides couldn't have been more dramatic. When the judge entered, silence fell over the room. Final statements began. Victoria's lead attorney spoke first. He painted a picture of a successful mother capable of providing unlimited opportunities for her daughter. Then he subtly portrayed Ethan as an ordinary mechanic struggling to keep pace with modern realities. The presentation was polished, effective, and devastating. Victoria watched with satisfaction. Every word reinforced the narrative she had carefully constructed. When it was Ethan's turn, the room waited for a dramatic response. None came. Ethan simply listened. No anger, no objections, no emotional outburst. Just silence. That silence unsettled more than a few people. Even Daniel Brooks seemed tense. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The divorce papers were placed before Ethan. The final documents. The signatures that would officially end 11 years of marriage. Victoria crossed her arms and watched closely. Richard leaned back with a smug grin. Several attorneys exchanged knowing looks. To them, this was the moment the loser finally accepted defeat. Ethan picked up the pen. For a brief second, the room became completely still. Images flashed through his mind. The day he met Victoria. The day Olivia was born. The nights he believed their family would last forever. The promises that had slowly turned into disappointments. The love that had eventually become resentment. Then he signed. One signature. One movement. 11 years reduced to a few strokes of ink. A quiet laugh escaped someone at Victoria's table, then another. Soon several people were smiling openly. Victoria herself shook her head and let out a soft chuckle. It wasn't loud enough to draw attention from the judge, but Ethan heard it clearly. The sound carried every ounce of her contempt, every assumption she had ever made about him, every judgment, every insult. To her, that signature represented surrender, proof that she had won, proof that she had been right all along. Ethan slowly placed the pen down. His face remained calm. No anger appeared in his eyes, no bitterness, no humiliation. He simply stood up and gathered his documents. Victoria expected some final reaction, a complaint, a plea, an accusation. Instead, Ethan looked toward Olivia, who sat quietly in the gallery, her eyes filled with confusion and sadness. He offered her a gentle smile. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, Victoria's quiet laughter lingered in the air. Around her, people smiled as though they had just witnessed the inevitable outcome of a battle between success and failure. None of them realized they had just celebrated far too early. None of them knew that the man walking out of that courtroom had spent years hiding a truth capable of destroying every assumption they had made about him. And as Ethan disappeared through the courthouse doors without looking back, the first cracks had already begun forming beneath the perfect world Victoria Hayes believed she controlled. 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Victoria Hayes expected to feel victorious. She had won nearly every battle she had fought in court. The legal proceedings had ended exactly as planned. The media portrayed her as a powerful woman moving forward with her life. Her board members congratulated her. Her friends celebrated her newfound freedom. By every measurable standard, she had achieved what she wanted. Yet for reasons she couldn't explain, an uncomfortable feeling lingered in the back of her mind. It was subtle at first, little more than a passing irritation. Whenever she thought about Ethan Carter, she remembered his expression as he signed the divorce papers. That was the problem. There hadn't been any expression at all. No anger, no humiliation, no desperation. Nothing. Most people facing the destruction of their marriage showed some sign of emotional collapse. Ethan had shown none. The memory followed her into meetings, dinners, and late-night strategy sessions. She found herself replaying the moment repeatedly, searching for something she might have missed. One evening, after a board meeting that ended with investors applauding another successful quarter, Victoria returned to her luxury penthouse overlooking downtown Chicago. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass walls, creating a view most people would consider breathtaking. Yet she barely noticed it. Her attention shifted toward Olivia, who sat cross-legged on the living room floor, drawing in a sketchbook. Since the divorce, Olivia had become quieter. She obeyed her mother-attended school and followed routines, but the spark in her eyes seemed dimmer. Victoria tried convincing herself it was temporary. Children adjusted. They always did. "What are you drawing?" Victoria asked casually as she removed her heels and sat nearby. Olivia looked up. "Dad's airplane." Victoria laughed softly. "Your father's airplane." Olivia nodded enthusiastically and turned the sketchbook around. The drawing showed a sleek white jet soaring through the clouds. Across the side of the aircraft, written in uneven handwriting, was a single word: Carter. Victoria smiled, assuming it was a childish fantasy. "That's a nice drawing, sweetheart." Olivia frowned. "It's not pretend." "What do you mean? Dad took me on it last summer." Victoria's smile faded slightly. "Your father doesn't own an airplane, Olivia." "Yes, he does." The girl sounded completely certain. "It's white with silver stripes, and everybody there knows him." Victoria stared at her daughter for several seconds before shaking her head. Children imagined all sorts of things. Maybe Ethan had taken her to an aviation museum. Maybe she had misunderstood something. Still, a small seed of curiosity had been planted. The next morning, Victoria nearly forgot about the conversation until she mentioned it jokingly during breakfast with her father. Richard Hayes burst into laughter. "A private jet," he said. "That's rich. The man's a mechanic." Victoria laughed as well, but the sound lacked conviction. "That's what I told her." Richard waved dismissively. "Kids invent stories. Don't waste energy thinking about it." Under normal circumstances, Victoria would have agreed. Yet later that afternoon, while reviewing quarterly reports in her office, she found herself remembering the certainty in Olivia's voice. It hadn't sounded like imagination. It had sounded like memory. The thought annoyed her. She hated uncertainty. Throughout her career, she had built success on information preparation and control. Questions demanded answers. By evening, she had made a decision. She would have Ethan investigated. Not because she believed he owned an airplane, but because she wanted peace of mind. 24 hours later, Richard arranged for one of his longtime private investigators to begin digging into Ethan's finances. The assignment seemed simple enough: track his accounts, examine his assets, review his business relationships. Within a week, they would have a complete picture. At least that was the expectation. Instead, the results created more questions than answers. A week later, Victoria sat across from the investigator in a conference room. The man looked unusually uncomfortable. Richard sat beside her, visibly irritated. "Well," Richard demanded, "what did you find?" The investigator opened a folder. "Honestly, not much." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means Ethan Carter has almost no visible financial footprint." Victoria crossed her arms. "Explain." The investigator slid several documents across the table. "He maintains ordinary checking accounts. No extravagant purchases, no luxury properties, no unusual investment activity. His tax records appear surprisingly modest." Richard smirked. "Exactly what we'd expect." The investigator hesitated. "Not exactly." The smirk vanished. "What do you mean?" The investigator adjusted his glasses. "Most people leave patterns. Spending habits, credit histories, investment trails. Ethan doesn't. It's almost as if large sections of his financial life simply don't exist." Victoria leaned forward. That's impossible. I know. The investigator looked genuinely frustrated. I've spent 20 years tracking wealthy individuals. Hidden assets always leave traces somewhere. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, property holdings, something. But with Ethan, he paused. Nothing connects. Richard scoffed. Maybe because there's nothing there. Maybe. The investigator sounded unconvinced. But if that's true, why are there so many gaps? The room fell silent. For the first time, Victoria felt a flicker of genuine unease. The conversation should have reassured her. Instead, it achieved the opposite. Over the following days, strange details continued accumulating. Small details, isolated details, meaningless by themselves, disturbing when combined. One afternoon, Olivia accidentally left her tablet on the kitchen counter. Victoria picked it up to return it and noticed several photographs open in the gallery. Most were ordinary family pictures. Then one image caught her attention. The photograph showed Olivia standing beside a private aircraft. Victoria froze. She enlarged the image. The jet was undeniably real. White exterior, silver detailing. Expensive, very expensive. Olivia appeared younger, perhaps 9 years old. Ethan stood beside her wearing sunglasses and smiling. The background showed a private runway. Victoria stared at the screen. Her first reaction was disbelief. Her second was irritation. Her third was fear. She immediately called Olivia into the room. Where did this picture come from? Olivia glanced at the screen. Dad took it. When? Last summer. Whose plane is that? Olivia looked confused by the question. Dad's. Victoria felt her pulse quicken. Are you sure? Mom. Olivia rolled her eyes in the way only children could. I've told you that already. Victoria suddenly realized she had no response. That night she barely slept. Every logical explanation she created collapsed under scrutiny. Maybe Ethan worked for someone wealthy. Maybe the aircraft belonged to a client. Maybe there was some misunderstanding. Yet none of those explanations accounted for the investigation results. None explained why airport photographs existed. None explained why Ethan had never mentioned any of it. Days later, another unexpected event deepened the mystery. Victoria attended an executive networking dinner at one of Chicago's most exclusive hotels. The ballroom overflowed with CEOs, investors, and industry leaders. During the evening, she found herself speaking with a venture capitalist from New York. Their conversation eventually shifted toward aviation. Have you heard about Carter Aviation Holdings? The investor asked casually. Victoria shook her head. No. Interesting company, quiet operation, huge growth. He sipped his wine. Nobody seems to know much about the founder. Victoria felt a strange chill. What's the founder's name? Carter. Nobody can even get a recent photograph. The investor laughed, almost mythical at this point. Victoria forced a smile, but her thoughts raced. Carter. It could have been coincidence. There were thousands of people named Carter, yet coincidence was beginning to feel less convincing with every passing day. The following week delivered the moment that changed everything. Victoria had traveled to a private airport outside Chicago to meet foreign investors arriving by charter jet. The airport catered exclusively to wealthy clients, corporate executives, and private aircraft owners. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Security personnel monitored every gate. The atmosphere radiated money. As Victoria stepped from her car, she reviewed talking points for the upcoming meeting. Then she noticed something unusual. Several airport employees were gathering near one section of the runway. Their behavior immediately caught her attention. Staff members stood straighter. Security officers appeared more alert. Ground crews moved with unusual urgency. Someone important was arriving. Curious. Victoria glanced toward the runway. A sleek black SUV rolled through a restricted gate and stopped near a private hangar. The driver exited first. Then the rear passenger door opened. Victoria's breath caught. Ethan Carter stepped out. For a moment, her brain refused to process what she was seeing. He looked exactly the same. Same modest jacket. Same calm demeanor. Same unremarkable appearance. Yet nothing around him was ordinary. The SUV alone cost more than most people's homes. More importantly, every airport employee seemed to recognize him. Several individuals approached immediately. One shook his hand. Another greeted him respectfully. A third nodded and stepped aside as though making way for someone important. Victoria watched in stunned silence. This made no sense. Ethan should not have been there. He definitely should not have been receiving that kind of treatment. Then the impossible happened. A large private jet emerged in the distance and began taxiing toward the hangar. The aircraft gleamed beneath the afternoon sunlight. It was beautiful, powerful, expensive beyond imagination. Victoria stared as the jet slowly approached. Something about it felt familiar. Then she saw the silver lettering along the fuselage. Her heart skipped a beat. One word. Carter. Exactly like Olivia's drawing. Exactly like the photograph. Exactly like the name she had heard at the investor dinner. The aircraft rolled to a stop. The cabin door opened. Executives in tailored suits descended the stairs. Several immediately walked toward Ethan. One of them extended his hand and smiled. Even from a distance, Victoria could see the respect in their body language, not the respect shown to an employee, not the respect shown to a mechanic, the respect shown to someone far above them, someone powerful, someone they answered to. Ethan exchanged a few words with the group. Then, surrounded by influential figures worth hundreds of millions of dollars, he calmly walked toward the waiting hangar as though he belonged there, as though he owned the place. Victoria stood frozen beside her car, unable to move, unable to think, unable to explain what she had just witnessed. For the first time since the divorce, genuine fear entered her heart. Because deep down she knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man she thought she knew did not exist. The man she had laughed at in court did not exist. The man she had spent years judging and humiliating was hiding something enormous. And whatever that secret was, it was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows. Victoria Hayes remained inside her car long after Ethan disappeared into the private hangar. The investors she had come to meet were forgotten. The presentation she had spent days preparing no longer mattered. Her fingers remained frozen around the steering wheel while her mind desperately searched for a logical explanation for what she had just witnessed. Every conclusion she reached seemed impossible. Yet the image refused to disappear. Ethan stepping out of a luxury SUV. Airport personnel greeting him with unmistakable respect. Executives in custom-tailored suits treating him as an equal or perhaps something more. And above all, the aircraft itself. The private jet bearing the Carter name. Not borrowed, not rented, not imagined by a child. Real. For the first time in years, Victoria felt something she rarely experienced. Uncertainty. She had built her career on certainty. She analyzed risks before others recognized them. She anticipated market shifts before competitors reacted. She controlled outcomes. Yet now she found herself staring into a mystery involving the one person she had convinced herself was completely predictable. The poor mechanic, the failed husband, the ordinary man she had spent years looking down upon. Suddenly, none of those labels seemed accurate anymore. That evening, she returned home without attending her investor meeting. Richard Hayes immediately noticed her unusual silence. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he remarked while pouring a glass of whiskey. Victoria stared out the penthouse window. "I saw Ethan today." Richard snorted. "And at Hawthorne Executive Airport." The old man's expression barely changed. "What's strange about that? He works around airplanes." Victoria slowly turned toward him. "Not like this." She then described everything she had seen: the SUV, the executives, the aircraft, the way people reacted to Ethan's presence. By the time she finished speaking, Richard's confidence had faded noticeably. "There has to be an explanation," he said. "Then find it." Richard immediately contacted the investigator again. This time, the instructions were simple: dig deeper, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it cost. They wanted answers. 48 hours later, the first crack appeared. The investigator called Richard directly. His voice sounded different, less confident, more cautious. "I found something." Richard smiled. "Finally." There was a pause. "You should sit down." Richard's smile disappeared. 20 minutes later, Victoria arrived at her father's office. The investigator had spread dozens of documents across a large conference table: corporate registrations, investment records, legal filings, aviation licenses, ownership structures. Victoria's eyes moved from page to page. At first, nothing made sense. Then she saw a familiar name: Carter Aviation Holdings. Her stomach tightened. "This company again?" she whispered. The investigator nodded. "I've spent the last 2 days tracing ownership structures." "And?" Richard demanded. The investigator inhaled slowly. "The company isn't owned by public shareholders. It's controlled through multiple trusts and holding corporations." Victoria frowned. "Who controls them?" Another pause. Then the investigator delivered the sentence that changed everything. "Ethan Carter." Silence filled the room. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. Richard actually laughed at first. It was the laugh of a man rejecting reality. "That's ridiculous." The investigator slid a document across the table. "It's verified." Richard stopped laughing. Victoria picked up the file. Her hands trembled slightly as she examined the paperwork. There it was, hidden beneath layers of legal structures. Ethan's name, Ethan's signature, Ethan's ownership authority. Her vision blurred. "No," she whispered. "That's impossible." The investigator looked almost sympathetic. "I thought so too." Victoria flipped through additional documents. Each page made the situation worse. Carter Aviation Holdings wasn't a small regional company. It wasn't a startup. It wasn't some side business. It owned aircraft maintenance centers across multiple states. It held contracts with private aviation operators. It leased aircraft fleets internationally. It invested in aerospace technology. The numbers became increasingly absurd. Hundreds of millions in assets. Massive annual revenues, expanding operations. The company was worth more than she could process. Richard leaned heavily against the table. "How much?" The investigator hesitated. "Current estimated valuation exceeds $900 million. Nobody spoke. Victoria felt as though the floor had vanished beneath her feet. 900 million. The number echoed inside her mind like an explosion. Her own company was successful. Extremely successful. Yet Ethan's hidden empire dwarfed everything she had ever believed about him. Worse still, it had apparently existed for years. Years. While she mocked him, while she introduced him as a mechanic, while she questioned his ambition, while she laughed at him in court. Ethan had been quietly building an empire large enough to compete with some of the most respected aviation firms in the country. The humiliation hit her with physical force. She remembered every dinner party, every sarcastic remark, every judgment. Suddenly, she wasn't the successful spouse who had carried the marriage. She was the fool who never understood the man sitting beside her. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. The investigator slowly shook his head. "There isn't." Then he delivered an even bigger shock. "The private jet alone is valued at nearly $80 million. Victoria closed her eyes. Olivia had been telling the truth all along. The drawing, the photographs, the stories, every word had been true. She had dismissed her own daughter because she believed she already knew everything about Ethan. The realization burned. But the nightmare was only beginning. The following week, Daniel Brooks filed a motion with the court requesting amendments to several divorce agreements. The legal argument was straightforward. Certain disclosures had never been fully examined because Ethan had intentionally kept his ownership structures separate from personal holdings. Everything was legal. Everything was documented. Yet the implications were explosive. When the court agreed to review the new evidence, reporters immediately seized the story. News outlets that had once celebrated Victoria's victory suddenly changed their tone. Headlines appeared everywhere. CEO divorces, secret aviation mogul, hidden empire revealed during divorce dispute, billionaire mechanic shocks, Chicago courtroom. Victoria watched the media frenzy unfold with growing horror. The narrative she had carefully built over months was collapsing in real time. People began asking questions. Why hadn't she known? Why had she underestimated him? Why had she publicly mocked a man who was clearly far more successful than anyone realized? For the first time in her professional life, Victoria became the subject of ridicule. Then came the court hearing. The room was packed. Reporters filled every available seat. Legal analysts crowded the back rows. Even people with no connection to the case wanted to witness what had become one of Chicago's most talked-about scandals. Victoria entered the courtroom feeling every pair of eyes following her. The atmosphere was completely different from the previous hearing. Gone were the sympathetic looks. Gone was the admiration. Gone was the certainty that she was the winner. Across the room sat Ethan. Calm as always. Quiet as always. His appearance hadn't changed. He still wore simple clothing. He still carried himself with modesty. Yet now everyone looked at him differently, because now they knew. The hearing began. Daniel Brooks stood and started presenting evidence. Charts appeared on screens. Financial statements followed. Corporate ownership structures, revenue reports, asset portfolios, aviation holdings, investment records. One by one, the numbers filled the courtroom. Audible gasps erupted several times. Even experienced attorneys appeared stunned. Victoria stared helplessly as years of hidden success unfolded before her eyes. Ethan never interrupted, never smiled, never celebrated. He simply sat there while the truth spoke for itself. The contrast made everything worse. If he had acted arrogant, perhaps she could have hated him. If he had mocked her, perhaps she could have fought back. Instead, he remained exactly the same man he had always been. Calm, patient, humble. The realization was devastating. Ethan had never changed. She had. Richard Hayes looked physically ill by the time the presentation ended. For years, he had treated Ethan like an embarrassment. Now he discovered that the man he considered inferior possessed greater wealth, greater influence, and perhaps greater respect than he ever would. Reporters rushed to send updates before the hearing even ended. News alerts exploded across social media. Television analysts debated the story. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions about Victoria's judgment. Board members quietly exchanged concerns. If a CEO could completely misjudge the man she lived with for over a decade, what else could she be misjudging? The question spread rapidly through financial circles. Victoria felt the consequences almost immediately. A major investor postponed a scheduled meeting. A board member requested a private discussion. Journalists started calling non-stop. The damage was spreading beyond the courtroom. It was spreading into her company, into her reputation, into the very foundation of her success. By the time the hearing concluded, Victoria no longer felt angry. She felt terrified, because she finally understood the truth. The greatest shock wasn't Ethan's money. It wasn't the jet. It wasn't the empire. It was realizing how completely she had misunderstood the man she once loved. She had spent years believing she stood above him. Years believing she was the successful one. Years believing she had outgrown him. Now the illusion had shattered. And as she exited the courthouse beneath a storm of flashing cameras, another devastating realization settled over her. The world wasn't laughing at Ethan anymore. The world was laughing at her. High above Chicago, the empire she had spent years building remained standing for now. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading through its foundation. Investors were nervous. Directors were concerned. Public opinion was shifting. And for the first time in her life, Victoria Hayes could feel control slipping through her fingers. Her perfect world, the world she had sacrificed everything to create, was beginning to collapse. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The months that followed felt very different from the storm that had consumed the lives of Ethan Carter and Victoria Hayes. The headlines eventually faded. The reporters moved on to newer scandals. The endless discussions on television disappeared. But for Victoria, the silence that remained was far louder than any public humiliation she had endured. For the first time in her life, she was forced to sit alone with the truth. Not the truth about Ethan's fortune. Not the truth about his private jet or his aviation empire. The truth about herself. She had spent years believing success was measured by status, wealth, and recognition. She had sacrificed dinners, birthdays, school events, and precious family moments while chasing the next achievement. In the process, she had overlooked the one thing that had been quietly standing beside her all along, a man whose greatest accomplishment was never the company he built, but the daughter he loved. One evening after attending yet another school event, she would have skipped in the past. Victoria found herself sitting alone on a park bench while Olivia played nearby. Ethan arrived a few minutes later to pick their daughter up. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There was no courtroom between them. No lawyers, no reporters, no audience. Just two people carrying the weight of years of mistakes. Victoria finally broke the silence. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked toward Olivia, who was laughing with friends in the distance. "Tell you what, who you really were." Ethan smiled faintly. "You knew who I was." Victoria lowered her eyes. "No, I knew what I thought you were." The sadness in her voice was impossible to miss. Ethan remained silent for several seconds before answering. "If I had needed money to prove my worth, then none of it would have meant anything." Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes. For months she had expected anger from him, resentment, revenge, some desire to make her suffer the way she had made him suffer. Yet he had done none of those things. Despite having every opportunity to destroy her reputation, he never attacked her publicly. Despite winning in the eyes of the world, he never celebrated her downfall. He simply continued being the same man he had always been. That realization hurt more than any punishment ever could. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she whispered, "for everything." Ethan looked at her, and for the first time in years, she saw no bitterness in his eyes, only peace. "We both made mistakes," he said gently. "The important thing is what happens next." At that moment, Olivia came running toward them, smiling brighter than either of them had seen in months. Without hesitation, she grabbed both of their hands. Victoria laughed through her tears. Ethan smiled. And for a brief moment, the broken pieces of their family seemed a little less broken. They never got back together. Life rarely offers such perfect endings. The wounds were too deep, and too much time had been lost. But something more important happened. Victoria changed. She learned to leave work early for school performances. She learned to listen instead of control. She learned that love required presence, not just provision. Ethan continued building his company, but he never allowed success to replace what mattered most. Together, they became better parents than they had ever been spouses. A year later, as Olivia stood on a stage receiving an academic award, both her mother and father sat proudly in the front row. No rivalry remained between them. No competition. Only pride. As the audience applauded, Olivia looked toward her parents and smiled. Ethan and Victoria exchanged a quiet glance. Neither needed to say anything. They both understood the lesson life had taught them. Wealth can build empires. Power can command respect. Success can attract admiration. But none of those things can replace time, family, humility, or love. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. It is choosing forgiveness when you finally have the power to make them regret everything.